Hello, you are listening to the Divorce University online podcast with your host, Tammy Ferreira.
Hey guys, Tammy here. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about, is your co-parenting causing stress for your child? Now, we all know the stress it causes for us, right? But sometimes we're not always thinking about the child. And what happens a lot of times that I see is that children are essentially caught in this vice grip. And so what can we do to try to release them from that level of stress that's going on? Now, if you're listening to the podcast or watching me on YouTube, don't forget to hit like and also subscribe so you get notified as new episodes or videos are released. But where I want to start with this is that the child knows when you're upset. They may not necessarily know why you're upset. And I think sometimes we feel like as long as we're not sharing what's going on or what the argument with the other parent is or what's happening in court or whatever, that we're doing our part. And I know that you can't just not feel the way that you feel. And I'm not suggesting that you can, but I think that we have to be aware of how our demeanor and how our mood and our attitude impacts our child. You know, I had a client say to me recently that her child said to her, "Mom, when you feel upset, I feel upset." And, you know, that really encapsulates the whole thing. And so when you're dealing with situations where you have this really high conflict ex who is a narcissist or borderline or something along those lines, and they have that way of moving through the world that is totally focused on themselves, and that's the only thing that they really care about, they're not really thinking about the child and what this is doing to them. And, you know, we can get upset about that and we can rail against it and all of those things. But at the end of the day, we can't change that. That's how that person is. And so if we are, by the same token, reacting and feeling upset and allowing our emotions to kind of overtake us, then what happens for the child is, you know, I describe it as being caught in this vice grip where they're essentially being crunched from both sides. You know, I've got mom who's not happy with me on this side for these things. I've got dad who's not happy with me on these side for these things. And so I'm just getting squeezed tighter and tighter and tighter. So if we know that we cannot change what the other parent is doing, we can't change the pressure that's coming from that side, what are we left with? We're left with the pressure that's coming from our side. And so I always say that the only choice that you have in this situation is to release the vice grip on your side. And so part of that is being aware of how your frustrations and your emotions are impacting the child. And so maybe when we're feeling that way, we have to take a time out, or we have to journal, or we have to go meditate, or we have to use some other kind of, you know, modality outside of ourselves to take that little time out to make sure that our emotions and our reactions are in check, so that then when we are face to face with the child and interacting, that we're able to be present and we're able to focus on, you know, what we want to focus on with them and our interaction with them. Because a child knows when you're not really paying attention, right? My grandson is a toddler, and believe me, even at that young of an age, if he doesn't truly have my full undivided attention, he knows and he fights for it. And, you know, I've been guilty of this in the past when my sons were young. I did a lot of, you know, oh, I'm busy right now. I'm doing this right now. I'm doing that right now. And sort of pouring myself into other things in order to distract myself from the pain of the current situation. And so, you know, we sometimes think that, oh, if I just tell the child I'm busy or tell the child I'm dealing with something else, then they'll go on and play and they'll be fine and they won't know that anything is going on. That's not true. You know, usually as a parent, we're very, very connected with our children. And so, you know, especially I think if you're mom, you know, we're more kind of emotional and we connect more kind of on that emotional level most of the time. And so, yeah, your children are going to probably have a lot of empathy around what you're feeling. And, you know, how you're behaving in the world. And so they're going to have concerns about that, and they're going to feel that empathy for you. And so the best way to shield them from that is try to actually deal with your emotions and not just push them down, and be able to, process them and move forward through them. So the next thing that I see that happens a lot is that when you have someone who has been through a domestic violence situation and they're coming out of that relationship, a lot of times they have what are more involuntary cues, like hidden cues, things that aren't obvious when you're having a conversation with them, things that don't come out verbally. That's the word I was looking for, nonverbal. They have nonverbal ways of communicating their frustration with the other parent. And again, especially when you have children, I think in that 6 to 10 year age range, they're to the point to where they know something's going on, but they don't know what's going on, right? I think below 5, they're a little more oblivious to what's going on. Right around 4 or 5, they start to figure out that something is going on. But that 5 to 10 year age range, they become very, very aware of the world around them, and they know something is happening even when they don't fully understand what it is. And so a lot of times what happens with domestic violence survivors is you have these nonverbal cues where, every time somebody says the other parent's name or mentions the other parent, mom or dad or whatever, maybe you clench your jaw. Maybe it just brings up this stress in you, and your nonverbal reaction is clenching your jaw, or maybe sometimes clenching your fist, or, we all have certain tells, is what Thomas used to call it. And he used to say this about the judges when they're frustrated with people in front of them. He said there was one in particular he would appear in front of, and he would pull his glasses down and look over the top of his glasses at the attorneys when he was annoyed with them or wanted them to stop talking or something like that. So we all have these little nonverbal tells that reflect how we feel. And of course, the people closest to you in your life, your significant other, your children, people that live in the household with you, are obviously going to pick up on that a lot more quickly than, somebody that doesn't live with you or doesn't have that level of intimate relationship. And so this comes from leftover trauma from the domestic violence where, again, you have these little nonverbal things that you do that say, I'm stressed when the subject of this person comes up. And so this is about dealing with your own trauma and your own issues, right? But I want you to be aware that this is reflected in the children. And so a lot of times children will say, oh, I don't want to go with this parent or that parent. And many, many times I find that that's because they think the parent they're with doesn't want them to, or it might hurt their feelings. Oh, if I say I want to go with mom, it might hurt dad's feelings. Or if I say I want to go with dad, it might hurt mom's feelings. And so even if you haven't verbalized that it hurts your feelings or it's any kind of problem or whatever, that may still be how your children are viewing those nonverbal reactions that you're having. And so it's real important after, especially after domestic violence trauma like that, that you get into therapy again and that you deal with your emotions. That's really what a lot of this comes back to is we're so busy in our day-to-day lives that we're not actually taking the time to process how we feel about things. And, you all know that I lost Thomas a few months ago, and this has kind of been a recurring theme that's been coming up as I'm going through the new podcasts and the new topics and things. But it's the same thing with the grief. I'm having to process that, right? And if I don't take the time to process it, then it's going to come out in other unhealthy coping mechanisms that are probably reflective to the people around me, the people closest to me, of that I'm still struggling. I've heard people say that they cut other people off, they kind of went into solitude, all these different ways of coping. And so when you're coping in unhealthy ways, you're not necessarily processing it and moving through it in a healthy way that allows you to let go of those feelings. Because if you have come out of a domestic violence relationship, but you still have the fear, anxiety, stress, and all of those things that were tied to that relationship, then you haven't fully processed it and dealt with it. And so when you've processed it and dealt with it, you're kind of on the other side of it and it doesn't come through in those ways. I'm definitely in the midst of trying to process my grief and my emotions, and I'm definitely not to the other side of it. And that's evident when you have a conversation with me because sometimes I cry, right? Or I talk about Thomas or, different things that I've done even here on the podcast where you can hear it come through. And so I think sometimes we're under the illusion that if I'm just keeping myself busy and I'm moving forward, then all of this is behind me and I've dealt with it and it's over. No, not true, especially when you have something like domestic violence that is very, very traumatic. You have to take the time to actually process that trauma and to actually be able to deal with it. And those types of things are very important for moving on to a new relationship and all of that. And so your children are still going to feel that as long as you're holding on to that and not moving through it. So the third thing that I see that really stresses the children out is being put in the middle. And what do I mean by this? This can take on a few different forms. And I think sometimes people aren't even aware that they're doing this. Sometimes they think they're doing everything they can not to put the children in the middle, when in fact, the children are being put in the middle. So I would say, first and foremost, the most obvious is if you're asking the child to carry a message to the other parent or ask the other parent if they can do such and such, or trying to coordinate exchange times or visits through the children, then you're putting the child in the middle because now the child has become the negotiator between the two parents. Because what if parent A says yes or parent B says no? Or what if parent A tells me to ask something and then I ask parent B and parent B obviously becomes upset? Now I feel bad because I've upset that parent, or maybe I'm scared because I'm afraid I'm going to get in trouble because I've upset that parent. The thing I can tell you about this from the parent's perspective is as this goes on, if this becomes chronic, when the children get into teenagehood and they're in like that 15, 16, 17-year age range, the wheels can really come off of your co-parenting relationship as a result of this, because what happens is we're kind of empowering the children, right? We're making them the negotiator, so they're ultimately the ones in control. And then what happens is you and the other parent have no control over these, higher age teenage years, which are some of the most difficult years as it already is to control the child. And so this is really going to undermine your parenting on both sides in the future. And I know, again, you can't always stop the other parent from doing that. But if the child comes and asks you something that you feel like the other parent shouldn't have had them ask, then what I would say to them is something along the lines of, that's probably not a really appropriate thing for me to discuss with you. I'll talk to your dad about it, or I'll talk to your mom about it, or whatever the situation is. And that way you're doing what you can from your end to pull the child out of it. Now, when we do this, it's important that you not go back and berate the other parent over it. So don't go back and start kind of giving this lecture over the fact that they did ask the child to say something or did ask the child to do that. So I think what you have to do is you have to, send a message that says something along the lines of, hey, the child mentioned this or asked this question, and I don't think it's really appropriate to be discussing it through the child. So I wanted to send you a message directly. Here are my thoughts on it. And that way you're getting that opportunity to sort of address it with that parent directly and tell them that you don't think it's appropriate that this conversation go through the child, but you're also not continuing to put the child in the middle. And so it becomes sort of a delicate balance of learning these little nuanced techniques and how to deal with situations and communication as they come up. Okay. But putting the child is in the middle is one of the number one things that I see that causes stress. And so a lot of times, we're asking questions about the other parent's world or what's going on or what they did or what was said or whatever. And those also put the child in the middle, because then the child has to think through, okay, am I, especially if you have a parent on the other end that's difficult, that's going, don't tell your parent this and don't tell your other parent that. And now the other parent is asking, guess what I'm doing? I'm squeezing that vice grip again, because now the child's going, okay, do I where do I put my loyalty, parent A or parent B? Do I tell them? Do I not tell them? How do I handle this situation? And honestly, you guys, think about it. How many times have you gotten a message from the other parent or had something happen where you're thinking, how do I handle this? I would bet more often you have that thought than just knowing what to do. And so imagine now we're putting this on your child who doesn't have the developmental maturity to even be able to reason what the best way to handle these situations are. And they're caught in the middle of two people that they love. And so, we have to really kind of think through things from the child's perspective, especially if you are seeing stress in your child, if they're having anxiety, if they're having those types of issues where they have anxiety, depression, a therapist is saying, I'm concerned, you're seeing, sometimes we see more extreme behaviors, cutting, different things like that. And so this is why it's real important to look through these things and try to remove as much pressure as we can from our side, regardless of what the other side's doing. All right. So the other thing that I think that causes an issue is when we have phone calls or video calls between the two houses. Now, if you guys have been listening to me for any length of time, you know that I always say I hate these. I really hate them. And I think it's sometimes appropriate in certain circumstances, but in the vast majority of circumstances, I just hate them. Okay. So I'm going to explain why. Now, if a child is very, very young, let's say like a year or maybe even up to 2 years, 2 years and under, and that frequent contact is real important for the bonding process, then I think short video calls can be appropriate. I think if you're asking a 1-year-old to stay on a call for 15 to 30 minutes, well, any of you that have a 1-year-old running around are going to know that that is near impossible. So you're going to maybe have a 3 to 5 minute call when they're that age. And so as they get older, that's not as necessary because they start to understand that we're still there and we exist even when they're not with us. Now, I think the other place that this is appropriate is when you have long distance parenting plans. So if you live on one side of the country and the other parent lives on the other side of the country, and you have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, ages where you're still kind of managing their communication and all that, I think that these calls are appropriate. And so it makes sense because they're not getting to see that other parent very often, probably if they live across the country. But in normal situations where, we have a 50-50 parenting plan and it's week on, week off, and I just personally don't like going that many days without talking to the children, I don't think it's helpful. And even when people say, oh, I don't like that, the children are stuck in this other world that I view as unhealthy, and I want to be able to be having contact with them to make sure they're okay. Well, okay, they're not okay emotionally, probably, if they're in a difficult situation with the other parent and they don't want to be there. Talking to you isn't going to fix that part of it. Probably physically they're okay. If they weren't, you'd be notified in some way. But here's what happens on those calls is the child is stuck between, again, parent A and parent B. Because if I'm sitting in parent A's home, then I'm worried, are they going to hear me? Maybe they're in the room with me, depending on the parent. Are they going to hear me? Are they going to be upset by anything I said? Am I going to get punished? Now I'm on the call or the video with parent B, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I keep parent B from feeling upset and, make them feel like I love them? And in some instances, I have people that say, my kids didn't even react or talk to me or whatever. Probably if that's what's happening, it's because you're the safe parent. So they know that they can hurt your feelings and that the relationship will still be there because you'll understand and the other parent won't. And so if you are getting kind of shunned on the calls, no, and the child is older like that, know that you're probably the safe parent, and that's probably why that's happening. Now, here would be my question for you. You know, if your child is stressed and your child is showing signs of anxiety, are there any red flag issues? What do I mean by red flag issues? I mean things like, is one parent driving drunk with the children in the car? Are they using drugs while children are in the household? Are there domestic violence incidences going on in their household that the children are observing? Things that would warrant CPS. And let me just tell you that CPS doesn't care if your children are being given a bag of gummy bears for dinner and staying up till midnight. Like that's not going to be enough for CPS to go, "Oh, the way this child is living, it overrides their safety is at risk and that overrides their relationship with their parent." Those kinds of petty day-to-day things, even though I would agree with you, they're not good parenting and not really how most of us would not let our children have a bag of gummy bears for dinner, right? We wouldn't do that. But you have to pick your battles and you have to know which ones are the important ones, because if you're picking battles over these small day-to-day issues and you call child welfare or you get experts involved, you're going to start being seen as the problem. And really, those types of investigations mean the child's going to be interviewed, right? The child's going to be talked to. A lot of times that can increase their stress and anxiety. So we don't want to be taking these things lightly, but if there are red flag issues that really truly involve the child's safety, then a lot of times what we do is say, depending on the situation and depending on exactly what your concern is, sometimes we say, get the child into therapy. That's usually our first defense. Always get the child in therapy. Number 2, if it's something physical, take them to their pediatrician to be examined, to let the pediatrician determine if they think that this is a safety issue. And if it is, that pediatrician will probably report it to child welfare and it won't be you. And so you have to be strategic in how you're handling situations as they come up and using that judgment to determine, is this something on the level of which I have a duty to protect my child? Or is this something that the court is going to see as one of those kind of garbage issues, so to speak, that they really don't favor one parent over the other over that kind of issue? And, this is a lot where my coaching comes in this kind of discernment and figuring out what things are important, what things aren't, how to communicate with the other parent about these issues in ways that, won't get you in trouble with the court and will build your credibility through that communication. And so you have to be real careful how you're handling these situations as they come up. And so we want to focus more on the solution aspect of this, of, getting the kids into therapy and trying to control our own reactions, our own emotions, our own behavior so that it doesn't trickle down into the children, not asking the children questions, not prying about what's going on. Sometimes in that particular aspect, I have people say, well, the child just volunteered it. I didn't ask any questions. Well, just because the child volunteers something doesn't mean that you have to keep digging, right? It doesn't mean that you have to keep peeling the onion layers back. You can acknowledge the child's feeling and then redirect them, which is what I usually will advise clients to do. And so don't go on a digging expedition just because, your child created the opening for you. And I do think it's important in those situations where you are trying to redirect them onto something else that you do acknowledge how they feel. So if they say, wow, the other parent got really angry at me and yelled at me and I was upset and I was crying. Okay, that's a situation where we may go, well, what were you upset about? Well, what was blah, blah, blah? And you cannot do that. That starts to be seen as you trying to micromanage the other parent's parenting time and their way of parenting in their household. And I have seen this come back to bite people down the road and cause them to lose parenting time or be accused of, trying to interfere in the other parent's parenting. And so if they say, look, I was really upset, dad yelled at me, mom yelled at me, I was crying, I was blah, 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 then my reaction to that would be, I'm really sorry. That sounds like it was really frustrating. Well, now that you're here, what do you want to do tonight? What should we plan? And again, just redirecting them, but also acknowledging that that's how they feel, because we don't want to compound the stress. We don't want to make them feel invalid or like how they feel doesn't matter. But we also have to be careful not to get ourselves in hot water in trying to dig deeper on an incident that, we weren't even present for. And remember, children are children, and usually their view of it is somewhat skewed and their recollection of it is somewhat skewed because they don't have that developmental ability, again, to really be able to understand all the dynamics of what's happening a lot of times. And that's why the court doesn't see them as particularly good witnesses. So I hope this has been helpful. If your children are having stress or anxiety, please try to look at some of these angles of your situation and figure out if maybe some of these could be contributing to the child's stress. And for goodness sake, if the child's not in therapy, please, 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 that's always your line of first defense for the child, for you, and in the court, is to get the child in therapy. I hope this has been helpful. If you'd like to learn more about my coaching services, please go to divorceuniversityonline.com/VIP-coaching. You can book a free strategy session there, and I'd love to chat with you and learn more about your situation and see if there's a way I can give you some support and help. All right, I will talk to you guys next week. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Divorce University online podcast with your host, Tammy Ferreira. For more information, visit www.divorceuniversityonline.com.